You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. Today, my very special guest is Timothy Ash. Timothy is a professional economist of over 30 years. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House in the Russia and Eurasia program, where his areas of expertise, among others, are the International Monetary Fund, international finance, BRICS economies, and of course, Russia and Ukraine. Timothy appears on a wide range of podcasts. He's written for publications all over the world. And I became aware of some of Tim's work when I was reading some of his excellent op-ed pieces in the Kyiv Post. For those of you that might not be aware, the Kyiv Post is the largest English language publication in Ukraine. And Tim has contributed quite a bit to that. So I hope to be discussing some of his work there during this interview. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome to the No Delusion Zone, Timothy Ash. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure, as I said. And as I also said, I have read some of your work, and especially in the Kyiv Post. And the one of the more recent ones that caught my eye, which is dear to my heart, was about the lack of Western leadership in terms of the war in Ukraine. I've spoken and written about that a lot. Some people say too much, but I don't think it can be too much, because the reason, in my opinion, Ukraine hasn't won the war is because of a lack of Western leadership. And I will criticize my own country, primarily coming from the Americans, from the Biden administration. Their fear, their irrational fear of nuclear escalation has prohibited them from giving Ukraine what they need to win the war, not just to survive another bloody day. And I'm talking also economically as well. You've written about the 300 plus billion frozen assets of Russia that could have been used for the last 2 plus almost 3 years to fund the Ukrainian defense against Russia. So I'm disgusted. If we could, why don't we start with that? If you could summarize, I guess, your article, and then any new thoughts you have about the failure of Western leadership in assisting Ukraine in their fight against Russian aggression.
Yeah, sure. Well, leadership, I guess we can go back a decade, and the lack of leadership really when it was really becoming very clear about Russia's agenda towards Ukraine and its malign actions against the West. I mean, if you think of the annexation of Crimea and then the first invasion of Ukraine, the Donbass, which was pretty clear it was Russian troops, and NATO and Western governments kind of ignored it and kind of pretended that it wasn't Russian troops when we all knew it was. And I think then leading up to the full-scale invasion, in the end, we hadn't shown enough strength towards Putin. We hadn't signaled the implications of an invasion. We hadn't done enough to deter him in those years and months leading up to that decision that he made to actually invade Ukraine. And I think, our softness, our inability to show strength in the lead up, I mean, was part of his decision set. I mean, essentially, he didn't think we'd do anything. He didn't think there would be many sanctions. He didn't think we'd militarily support Ukraine. Obviously, he misread Ukraine. He misread Ukraine's willingness to fight and all those kind of things. And I think subsequently, I mean, I guess, the concern about Russia as a nuclear power, right? I mean, I get that. And I guess concern about Putin's red lines. And I guess in the early weeks and months after the full-scale invasion, I guess it was clear that Ukraine was, at that point in time, much more important to Putin than us. It felt like he had escalation dominance. He was willing to go to war for Ukraine. We weren't willing to go to war for Ukraine. He seemed to have the advantage. But I think what's been interesting is, how we should have learned from his actions over the months and years after the invasion. I think we should have better understood Putin's red lines and the fact that actually Putin is unwilling to escalate against NATO, because I think one of my big conclusions from more than 2.5 years of war is Putin's actually scared to get into a direct war with NATO, because he knows he will lose it. He will lose it very quickly, and it's a reflection of the fact that he's 2.5 years into this war. a supposed superpower, Russia, with overwhelming superiority over Ukraine, has not been able to win, right? And I think it reflects the fact, actually, that Russia's conventional military kit is substandard to NATO's, right? You could argue that Ukraine has been using sort of second and third generation NATO kit versus Russia's fourth, and it's held its own, which does go to show that NATO has this enormous military technological superiority over Ukraine, possibly being seen also in the Middle East at the moment between Israel and Iran, etc. And I think Putin set plenty of red lines in the period since the invasion. Had red lines about the supply of weapons, Western weapons to Ukraine, whether it was initially T-72s, MiG-29s from emerging Europe, Eastern Europe, HIMARS, M155, etc. Then obviously lots of focus on Leopards and ATACMS and finally F-16s. He set these red lines and sent a message that if you deliver them, that is escalation. I will respond aggressively. But he didn't do anything, right? He didn't bomb NATO's supply lines. He could have done easily, would have sent a very strong signal. And the big message to me was, he's afraid of escalation. He doesn't want a war with NATO, a bit like Iran doesn't want a war with the US around what's going on now in Gaza or Israel. Putin's exactly the same. Similarly, if you think about it, a lot of concern in kind of mid-22 around whether Putin would use weapons of mass destruction, right, to take the advantage in Ukraine. He hasn't. He hasn't because there are constraints on his actions. The constraints is, I think NATO made it clear at that point in time that they would see that as a massive escalation. They would respond in a conventional manner, probably bombing Russian forces in Ukraine. And I think the Chinese also sent a very clear message to him that they didn't want him to escalate to the point that it impacts on global markets, which would have been very detrimental to China and the Chinese economy. So, Putin, there are definitely constraints on Putin. He set red lines, he's not kept to them. My read is that NATO could supply the full range of conventional kit to Ukraine, and we wouldn't see significant Russian escalation. I mean, it's also quite extraordinary that this week we've seen the US supply THAADs to Israel. And there's been messaging that, the Ukrainians said, well, what about us? We're defending democracy as well. We've suffered aggression, state terrorism, invasion. What about sending us missile defense systems? And again, NATO or the US has responded. It's worried about escalation from Russia in response to it. But let's just get this straight. Ukraine. If we extend air defenses over Ukrainian territory, we are defending Ukraine against attack from Russia. I'm not saying NATO's missile defenses are used to launch attacks into Russia, but simply defending Ukrainian airspace against aggression from Ukraine cannot be seen as escalation. It's defensive. Again, the timidity is just quite extraordinary. And I think it gives the wrong signals to Putin. It's breathed new life into his offensive operations against Ukraine. It's extended the war much longer than need be. And I think it's just a fundamental, constant misreading of Putin and Russia.
Well, you mentioned America recently going to the defense of Israel and supplying them with some of the very same weapons that Ukraine has been begging for almost 3 years. I find that the height of hypocrisy, even during the first massive missile attack on Israel by Iran and Hamas, actually. Hamas backed by Iran, the United States helped Israel shoot down a great deal of them. They helped close the skies, essentially, over Israel, yet they're refusing to do the same thing over Ukraine. I just find that the height of hypocrisy. Let me ask you this. I mean, and I reread your article and some other ones about the fear, the irrational fear that Jake Sullivan, Biden, and some of the others in his administration have about escalation. It's been almost 3 years now. And as you just mentioned, we, the West, have crossed every line that Putin has put up, every red line. And obviously, there's been no nuclear escalation. In fact, his forces are decimated. Why, in your opinion, and I know you've written about this, why do you feel the West? Well, let's just talk about America right now. Why does the American administration still have this irrational fear of escalation if they defend Ukraine against Russian aggression, to the point of even closing off their skies, as you just mentioned?
Well, I would go way back to the outset of the Biden administration. And I think particularly Jake Sullivan in setting national security policy. I think Sullivan in particular, and unfortunately, I guess it's a mistake that is constant or profligate within the US security establishment. I think they put China as the number one national security threat to the US and the West. And Russia was very low down the pecking order. You know, they viewed Russia as a declining power with no ability to project force, particularly. That was, for me, totally wrong. And I accept the long-term threat to US hegemony from China. I get it. I get that China is this, developing, growing economy that is an increasingly is using that economic prowess to develop its military capability. But I would say the near and present danger is not China. The China threat is still some years out. I think the most immediate threat is Russia, and I say that because Russia, and I think Putin, has a problem with us, with our system of government. Right? This guy has used weapons of mass destruction already twice on NATO streets, twice. The Salisbury Novichok attack, and also the Litvinenko, again, use of radioactive material in the UK. Putin has a problem with our system of Western liberal market democracy. He thinks we're at war with him. He's at war with us. It's a battle for existential battle for survival between two regimes. And I think Putin is on the offensive. He wants to change us, our systems. Because he would argue, going back to 2011 and the street demonstrations, the West has a thing for him. They want to, I guess, he would argue that, there's a track record of autocratic regimes falling and, two democratic reform revolutions, Ukraine twice, obviously the Orange Revolution and then the Euromaidan. But I think if you look at Putin's actions, Putin has acted to undermine us from within. He's interfered in our elections. He's backed far right and far left parties. As I mentioned, he's used weapons of mass destruction on our streets. He wants to destroy us from within. He wants to corrupt us from within. He's used the mass, energy riches of Russia to buy off our politicians, our businesses, our banks, our media, our sports, because he wants to change our systems from Western liberal market democracy to an autocratic, kleptocratic system. That's his, and I think he wants to fundamentally change us. Interestingly, I would argue China doesn't. China is very happy with the global status quo, right? I mean, its agenda, and I would see it as a threat over the long term, its agenda is to benefit from globalization and free trade, to avoid getting involved in wars, to build its economy where eventually it has economic hegemony over the US and eventually military hegemony. But I think that's some years out, and we can do lots of non-military things to counter that. But fundamentally, President Xi loves the status quo, right? He likes, the ability of China to interact with the US and Western economies on global markets. He doesn't want to disrupt that. And I don't think he's particularly intervening in our systems to change us from within, whereas Putin is.
Well, yeah, China wants the global economy to grow because they want to be the on the top of the economy. They want to control the global economy. They want to become richer, at least Xi does. So they don't want to destroy it. Where I think you're absolutely correct. Putin hates the international system the way that it is. He wants to destroy it and hear from the West, from from within. Let me say something, if I could, Tim, and jump into what you're saying and follow up on it. I personally feel that following up on why the Biden administration and America in general, our government, our military is hesitant to supply Ukraine with all the weapons, all the tools they need to win the war. I believe you cannot overestimate the power, the influence of the far right, MAGA, if you will, within the government here at every level, and I'll say this, and it's controversial, but I believe that there's a racist tinge to this, a racist element, meaning MAGA, the hardest core right element in the United States, very much identifies with Russia, with Putin, with the Orthodox Church, with many of the claims that he makes, whereas China is the other. They are Asian. They have a completely different culture, different history, different religion. And many may say, well, you're crazy. No, for the far right and MAGA, that's extremely important. And in my opinion, and this is based on a lot of evidence, that is one of the main reasons they believe China is the number one enemy and that we should back off on Russia because they're not our enemy. Thoughts on that?
Well, I actually agree with you, right? I mean, I think that far right kind of white supremacist kind of group, promoted by Russia, backed by Russia, funded by Russia, I think also seen in the UK with the Brexit movement. I mean, I think they see this, the Russian Christian, white Christian kind of society, whatever, is a natural ally in the future battle against China. I would counter that by saying that, I think if that's the case, I think you will fundamentally change the nature of the US from a democracy to a kleptocratic autocracy. You will also do the same in Western civilization more generally. I would argue that that basic, Western liberal market democracy has been the basis of our economic hegemony over the last 50, 100 years or longer, right? If you go down that slippery slope, I mean, you're no better than China, actually. And I would just go back to Ukraine and a message for Jake Sullivan and the Biden and perhaps even the Trump administrations that are coming in. I think unless you beat Russia, you have no chance of beating China. In fact, the best message to China to steer clear of Taiwan and further expansion is to make sure that Ukraine defeats Russia. Right. I mean, it would show the strength and unity of Western liberal market democracy. It would show that you don't mess with the US and its allies. It would be an incredible deterrent to China, actually.
Well, I agree with you. And you know what? They get that. They're not stupid people, Tim. The Jake Sullivans and all his advisors, they're not stupid. They know that. But I truly believe that the racist, pro-Russian sentiment within the far right is so deep that they will ignore that, just as the far right in America, and I'm sorry, as well as in the UK to a degree, ignores all logic. They become irrational in supporting their guy, their convictions, and they will even they will not admit to the facts and about what you just said, and they will support Russia to the end. I just very quickly, after the 2016 election, there was a series of interviews done by several major media platforms here in America after it was revealed that Russia had interfered in our election. The FBI proved this. And the reporters went around to Trump supporters after the election, interviewed them, showed them transcripts of social media that was circulating in America prior to the election, and proved to them these were Russian operatives, bots, or in some cases, GRU operatives posing as Americans to influence their vote in the 2016 election. And when they were showed this evidence, literally reading it on camera, many of the Trump supporters who read it and were convinced that, well, okay, this was Russia, said, we don't care. That's okay. Russia's not so bad. I still support Trump, even if Russia had convinced me to do so. That was 8 years ago. And I believe that we're worse off now in terms of support for Russia by the far right, at least in this country, than we were then. So it's crazy. It's irrational. And they are going to support Russia. If I don't want to jump ahead here, but I think this is a disaster. And if Trump, of course, becomes the president, it's only going to get worse. And in my opinion, it's based on racism. Western racism against China and in support of Russia, regardless of the clear and present danger that Putin poses to the entire world of Western democracies.
You know, I totally agree with you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, but in America, this is not a very popular statement. If when people say that, they get they get threatened. Actually, they get threatened with their life. In some cases. Let me ask you this. I will jump to Trump because we can't escape it. Again, the 800-pound gorilla, the elephant in the room, all the cliches. If Trump is elected again and becomes president, what's your opinion? The two-part question. What's your opinion on, not forget the support for Ukraine. We'll get to that. I think that's obvious. But what about the international the consequences for the international economy? That's something that I know that you think about a lot. You discuss this a lot. Not something that's discussed too much here in the States. What's going to be the results of a Trump administration on the international economy, especially in the West?
Well, I mean, we had some of it in the first Trump administration, right? And this week he's been pretty vocal. It's about tariffs, about protectionism, America first. I mean, that means, we kind of know what that means. That means higher inflation, less trade, lower global growth, right? It means we're all worse off. I mean, internationally, in terms of the US position in the world, I think the US success over the last 100 years has been based on the strength of its rule of law, values, and alliances. It's benefited from a very strong alliance with countries in Western Europe, but internationally, New Zealand, Australia, etc., that share common values and the rule of law. I think a second Trump administration we'd see an erosion of that conflict or tensions with allies, particularly the European Union, every man for himself. And I think enemies of the US and actually Western liberal market democracy will benefit from that. China, Russia, etc. ultimately will play a card to divide and rule within the West. So in the end, I can't see that as particularly beneficial, right? US leadership globally will be diminished. Countries will be going off and doing their own thing. Efforts to de-dollarize, I guess, will accelerate. Countries will be trading in their own kind of currency spheres. I don't see that as a particularly optimistic outlook for the global economy. I think actually, in particular, the US through the inflation channel. I mean, already there's been a survey. I think the FT Wall Street Journal did a survey of economists in the US, what they think a second Trump term would mean. And I think universally, the message is higher inflation. Because in the end, if you impose tariffs, if you impose tariffs on cheap imports, the end result has got to be higher prices. I mean, it is fact. That is the result. People will have to pay more for goods.
Well, Trump doesn't understand what tariffs are. He doesn't understand many things. If you're speaking directly to MAGA right now, Tim, the far right, at least in America, could you give them any positive feedback on what a second Trump administration will do to the American economy? First of all, do you see any bright lights on what little he's put out about a second Trump administration? Is there anything that you've read that he said or proposed that's going to help the American economy?
Well, look, I mean, it's a pro-growth agenda, clearly, deregulation, the rich will make more money and the poor will be poorer. I mean, that's probably the conclusion. You only have to look at the people that are supporting Donald Trump. I mean, they're the multi-billionaires of both the US economy and globally, right? I mean, they see advantage in supporting a second Trump term. I mean, why is that? I mean, none of the. I mean, it's ironic that many of those same billionaires made a lot of their money in globalization, right? A lot of those guys made money by offshoring US jobs to cheap labor locations in China and elsewhere, right? And now, I mean, they want their cake and they want to eat it, right? I mean, now they're backing a second Trump term. I mean, because presumably they're not satisfied with the billions they have already, right?
Well, do you believe that a second Trump administration is actually going to bring back jobs to America, or is that just some BS?
Well, I think, if globally, if it's going to be higher inflation and lower growth, less trade, less growth, ultimately we all suffer, right? And I guess in a if a second Trump administration is about deregulation, I guess there will be more jobs probably, but they'll be less paid and less well protected, right? So again, the poorer sections of U.S. society will do less well, right?
Well,
and actually, interestingly.
Go ahead.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, you live in the US. I mean, I've traveled there quite a lot recently. There seems to be plenty of job notices when you travel around the US. You go to restaurants, you go whatever. There's lots of signs saying, we're recruiting, whatever. And the combination of tariffs and deportation of migrants, right, will just increase inflation and costs, right? I mean, there'll be labor shortages. I mean, it's an interesting week we just gone through, right? Daran Acemoglu, an American Turkish Armenian economist, won a Nobel Prize for his work on why countries succeed or fail, right? And one of them is institutions, strength of institutions and rule of law, right? I guess what we learned from the first Trump presidency is Trump's all about weakening them. It's not about accountability. It's about, no rules for a particular section of the US population, the elites, his family, laws don't apply to him. And interesting, we had that Supreme Court ruling making the presidency almost a sun god. I mean, you guys fought an independence war against us, the Brits, to kick us out, to kick our king out. And your Supreme Court goes and creates a new one in Donald Trump a US president that is absolutely unaccountable.
Well, they're all for free
staggering.
Speech, as long as it's their speech that's protected. Yeah. And there's a funny joke not so funny, ironic joke about what you were saying about the fact that there are many, many jobs. We have probably more job openings now than we've had in many, many years. But the joke that goes around is that when I talk to my friend, he says, yeah, there's a lot of jobs. I've got 3 of them. Because that's what it takes to survive. They're all minimum wage jobs. If you go down the street in almost any town in America, all of the fast food places are hiring. The 7-Elevens and the 24-hour grocery stores and the gas stations. They're all hiring low-paying retail jobs, minimum wage jobs. There's millions of them, and people do in fact need 2 and 3 jobs just to survive. And ironically, and you were correct, of course, who supports Trump or the billionaires, because they get the tax breaks and the breaks for their businesses. But ironically, Tim, and I'm sure you know this, his other base of support are from the poor, from the lowest strata. They support him, the lower or even unemployed blue collar workers, because of their rage, of the manufactured rage, for the most part. About the loss of jobs, the loss of the manufacturing base in America, even though he's taken away their jobs, he's taken away their health care. He's setting the United States up for a very grim economic future, not to mention a chaos in terms of law and order and possibly martial law. But they are the basis of MAGA. The very upper end and the very lower end, and that to me is just staggering. And it's not a very good fact that so many people that are being hurt by his policies are the biggest source of his support, aside from the billionaires.
Absolutely. I mean, again, U.S. success historically has been built on rule of law, strong institutions, and migration. I mean, you are a country of inward migration, right? I mean, it's
the Statue of Liberty. Look at it.
Utterly extraordinary that he's going to put significant constraint on that. And anyway, whatever. It's your country. It's your election. Unfortunately, the US impacts on the world, right?
Well,
and a second Trump term, in my mind, would create huge insecurity globally, because two things in particular. Obviously there's a conflict at the moment in the Middle East. I think the Biden administration, has not done enough in terms of constraining Israel in terms of what it's doing. It needs to do more. It needs to focus more, certainly, on the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon and Gaza. I think, and actually, if anything, perhaps the Biden administration has managed to avoid an all-out war between Israel and Iran, and then it would drag in the US. I worry that a second Trump term with Trump, in a way, he's relatively moderate on Israel, Iran, compared to some of the GAP, the traditionalists in the GAP that, I think would want a defining war with Iran. That would be a major concern for me. And the second one is obviously, the topic of this conversation, Ukraine, right? I know Trump goes on about the fact that, he can end the war in a day or 2 days or whatever it is, as soon as he takes office. It's more complicated than that, right? And we need a sustainable peace, and imposing a solution on Ukraine that is actually a defeat will be hugely destabilizing for Ukraine itself. It risks state failure in Ukraine. It risks the implosion of Ukraine and huge out-migration of tens of millions of Ukrainians west, which would destabilize Western Europe. It would impose huge social, political, and economic costs on Europe, which I would argue would undermine the NATO security, European security and the NATO alliance, to the huge benefit of Putin and the US enemies globally, including China. No, I don't think a weakened Europe because Trump throws in the towel to Putin on Ukraine is in the interests of the US, right? If the US is eventually going to counter China's military and economic hegemony, it needs Europe and it needs its allies in Western liberal market democracies. And destabilizing Europe by throwing the towel in on Ukraine will not help that.
No, in fact, I believe, and I'm not alone in this, that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, God forbid, and Trump becomes president, this will drive Russia closer to China, because they will see an ally. Not that they want to be allied with Russia, but if we're going to ignore them, if we're going to allow Russia to do this, they're going to form a tighter relationship with Russia, and this is not in the interests of the United States. Tim, what about the $300 billion? Why hasn't that been released yet? What are the political or economic rationale for not using that to not only fight Russian aggression, but to help rebuild Ukraine? If you could just talk about that for a while.
Yeah. No, I think it's probably useful here to put some numbers on Western support for Ukraine, right, as a starting point. And I know people like J.D. Vance has made a big thing about, the US, the amount of money. Actually, Trump has talked about the hundreds of billions of US support for Ukraine. The numbers do not support that. We have hard data now in terms of actually what it's costing the West to support Ukraine. And the hard numbers, it's about $100 billion a year. That's what it's cost since the full-scale invasion in February 22. $100 billion a year. So it's about, give or take the odd billion, it's about $250 billion so far. That sounds a lot. It is a lot. Yes. Now, if you look at the US share of that, it's about 40%. 40% of the $100 billion a year, roughly, has been provided by the US. The rest have been provided by Europe and other allies. Yes, if you look at the military component, of the $100 billion a year something like 60 billion is military support. Of that, I'd say 2/3 is provided by the US. But overall, it's still the 40% of the 100 billion. So about 40 billion a year of US support. It's about 100 billion a year of US support since the full-scale invasion. Again, it's a big number. I accept that. But what's the price of defeating Putin, ensuring Ukraine doesn't lose, ensuring, again, a catastrophic situation in Ukraine of a defeat would mean, I mentioned the tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west. Interestingly, when it comes to the US, if you look at the 40 billion a year, most of that has been provided in military support, right? A lot of it has been old US equipment that has been donated, that would have been destroyed or mothballed or whatever. It's been in increased defense sales from the US. So US companies, US workers have benefited because the US has been spending money to support Ukraine. Interestingly, also, Western defense spending overall has increased. NATO in Europe is spending about $200 billion a year extra, more than it was because of the threat from Russia. Because of the US superiority in terms of military technology, a large part of that stays in the US. I would perhaps argue that on balance, the war in Ukraine, the US is a net beneficiary. It is actually benefiting through increased defense sales from its European allies and from Ukraine, because the only place they can buy quality equipment in scale is from the US. So, this idea that Ukraine is a huge drag on the US economy and the budget is ridiculous. It's not. This is an investment. There's a big beneficiary to the US economy. Ultimately, this is an investment in our own defense, because if we beat Putin, we're safer. It sends a really strong message to China in terms of don't mess in Taiwan. Now, in terms of the funding, if Trump wins, that 40 billion a year probably will drop off a cliff. Ukraine will be left with a huge financing hole. Europe will have to step up. It will be difficult. Now, there's a huge question of how Ukraine is going to fund itself going forward with the Trump presidency. I have been arguing for 2 years that actually it's a much fairer thing for Russia to pay the cost of defending Ukraine. And there is $330 billion of central bank of Russia reserves in Western banks. It's been immobilized. We should change laws, do whatever it's required to allow Ukraine to tap that so it can meet its own defense spending needs. That 100 billion a year it could use from the 330 billion of frozen Russian assets, immobilized Russian assets. It would cover 3 years of funding of Ukraine. It would enable Ukraine to buy the military kit, probably from the US, helping the US economy, helping US workers, and it would bring about the speedy end to the war. Why haven't we done it? We haven't done it because of global bureaucracy or bureaucracy in Western countries, lobbying by various Western business interests. In particular, Belgium is the home to a large weight of the money. About 170 billion is in Euroclear. The Belgians, I think, have lobbied aggressively against it. They argue it will destabilize the global economy. The position of the euro and the dollar as reserve currencies would be diminished. I say absolutely not. I say not because we've already moved to immobilize and freeze these assets. There's been no evidence the likes of Saudi Arabia and China have moved assets from Western jurisdictions. There's no alternative at present to holding reserve currencies in dollars and euros and sterling. They don't trust each other. The Saudis are not going to put money in the Chinese currency. The Chinese are not going to do the same. There's no alternative, right? We have to think about our own interests. Our own interests are adequately funding Ukraine to win. The only way to do that is use of immobilized Russian assets. And actually, you asked me right at the start about Western leadership. If you look at sanctions and policy around frozen Russian assets, the Biden administration is very much focused on providing a united front, making sure all allies move together, we get agreement from everyone. I mean, what's the reality? What it's meant is by sanctions and decisions by the highest common denominator, right? So it meant we've done less, keeping everyone on board. Lots of different countries always have objections to this sanction or that sanction. and respect to frozen Russian assets, right? The Belgians basically have more or less vetoed the decision. I would have argued that the Biden administration should have said, this is a national security priority of the West. Ukraine has to win this war. Russia has to be defeated. We have to make sure Ukraine is adequately funded to win the war. You know, why should Western taxpayers pay for Putin bombing Ukraine? Putin should pay. So actually, this 330 billion should be put in a sovereign wealth fund or whatever, a fund to be used to fund Ukraine's victory or Ukraine's pursuit of the war, buying defense equipment from the Americans and Europeans or whoever. Wherever they can buy it, they should be able to use this money to do it. You know, that's fundamentally, it's a lack of leadership. It's a lack of understanding the priority of global national security risks and understanding that Russia is top of the list. And that we absolutely have to do everything we possibly can to ensure Russia's defeat. That's been the problem with, you know, Western military support for Ukraine. You know, that the Ukrainians have had to beg for T-72s, MiG-29s, HIMARS, ATACMS, Leopard tanks, Taurus missiles, F-16s. You know, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that these brave Ukrainians that are fighting, they've lost hundreds of thousands of dead, you know, thousands injured, hundreds of thousands injured, fighting on our behalf in defense of us, defense of Western liberal market democracy. They've had to beg for support from us. We failed them dismally. You know, and unfortunately, you know, likely a Trump administration would throw in the towel to Putin. And you know, all those many Ukrainian lives that have been lost over the last couple of years, they'll be in vain, right? Because Putin, you know, Trump thinks he understands Putin, right? Because he's met him, he's sort of, you know, exchanged pleasantries. You know, Trump sent him some COVID tests, etc. He cares so much about Putin's health. Trump doesn't understand Putin. Putin is a vicious killer. Well, I would hope Trump doesn't understand Putin, right? He's a vicious killer that will stop at nothing to get what he wants. He's a mafia boss. He's a bully. He's a thug. He only respects force, power and force. The Ukrainians have stopped him in their tracks, right? If Trump surrenders Ukraine to Putin, let's say around the terms that were suggested by J.D. Vance, which is this idea of neutrality, let Russia keep what it's got. Putin will not be happy with that. Putin will want more. He will see weakness. You know, every example, every time Putin over the last 20 years has taken territory in emerging Europe, whether it's Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, it's Transnistria in Moldova, it's Crimea, it's Donbass, and now with a full-scale invasion. Every time he's done it and got away with it, he's wanted more because he sees weakness, he smells fear, and he thinks he can get away with more. Putin is an old-style imperialist, a colonizer. You know, it's Soviet mentality, right? He's a threat to us, he's our system. You know, he won't stop in Ukraine. He will carry on. And the US allies in Europe should be very worried if Trump throws in the towel and doesn't continue to support Ukraine.
Well, you know, I'll go beyond what you're saying because I'm not very polite. They're cowards. They're cowards, and many of them are greedy. And I want to ask you about that just from a money standpoint. And I've written about this before. I happen to believe, especially in Germany, that one of the reasons that for the slow support of Ukraine by many in Western Europe has to do with business interests, with greed. And I still think that's the case. Is it the primary cause? Probably not. But originally, I believe that it was, especially among the leaders and former leaders of some of the Western countries, specifically Germany's, and certainly among the CEOs of some of the larger Western countries. And that's beyond a disgrace that they would sacrifice Ukraine and possibly their own countries in the near future solely because of business ties that they have within Russia. I don't know if you want to comment on that. You don't have to, but that just makes my blood boil. But it's cowardice, in my opinion. It's cowardice because not just that they're afraid to commit their military to defend Ukraine. It's cowardice Tim, because the leaders in Western Europe, for the most part, not all of them, certainly, have not been able to address their own people and honestly tell them what you've just been saying, the threat that Putin poses to them, to their country, to their families, to their future. They've been hiding it. And that's why the vast majority of the people in Western Europe aren't supporting an increased budget to defend Ukraine. They don't think there's any big deal. And not to mention the Russian operatives that are flooding Western Europe right now with all kinds of misinformation and lies and sabotage and all kinds of other cyber attacks and so forth. But it's cowardice by the Western leadership. And I could go on with that, but I want to ask you something else on an economic note. Much has been written, of course, about the sanctions, that there's not enough, there's too much. I feel they're a disgrace. There's certainly not enough, and they haven't enforced them. What, in your opinion, is the status on the Russian economy, the ability to wage war thus far, currently, on the Western, in regards to the Western sanctions? Are they having an effect? Will they ever have an effect? And what should be done in the future if there was a spine within NATO?
Well, just linking the two questions, or your points and then the question. Trump was right in one thing, calling out the German establishment for its appeasement of Russia and its corruption around energy. And, I think we haven't really, we didn't really accept the scale of the threat from Russia. We didn't really understand the scale of the infiltration and what the project was from Putin. The project was to destroy us from within, corrupt us from within. And, there's been about $2 trillion of capital flight out of Russia in the last 30 years, right, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a huge number. That huge amounts of money have been deployed by Russia and Russians into Europe and into Western economies. And they've bought influence, they've bought companies, they've bought banks, they've bought bankers, they've bought energy companies, they've bought football clubs, they've bought media companies, they've bought politicians, they've bought chairs of universities. Why have they done that? Right? They've done that to corrupt us from within. Why would a Russian oligarch want to own a football club in the UK? Right? Why? Because you want to influence the information narrative, right? You want to influence the opinion of the ordinary citizens to a pro-Russian, pro-Putin, pro-Kremlin kind of agenda, right? And, those chickens have all come home to roost now, right? And I think we've only just realized the extent of infiltration, and probably, hopefully, just before it's too late. Now, we haven't really understood the threat. On the sanctions front, sanctions are a complicated issue. We impose lots of sanctions on lots of different countries. I think we tend to forget that the sanctioned country doesn't stand still. It always tries to, it's a moving target. It always tries to get around sanctions. There are plenty of international players, and some of those appeasers in Europe that I've mentioned are more than happy to take Putin's 40 pieces of silver and help Russia get around them. So we need to be very clever in terms of secondary sanctions. But actually, interestingly, I mean, the durability of the Russian economy, I'd say, is due to a few things. One is Putin knew he was going to invade, right? He had the advantage over us. I personally think he was planning an invasion as far back as 2014. So 8 years in advance. I actually wrote in the Kiev Post in 2015 that there was going to be a defining war between Russia and Ukraine. It was pretty clear already in 21 it's going to happen. Putin knew it was going to happen, so he built up his defenses. He deleveraged the Russian economy, and he built up foreign exchange reserves because he knew there was going to be some sanctions. There was going to be a long period of difficulty in relations with the West. He needed buffers. So he had a lot of buffers, a lot of insulation. So that's one point. The second point is, and going back to this idea of appeasement, Western sanctions have been too soft, right? And it relates to a number of things. It relates to the fact that the Biden administration, rather than imposing sanctions, if US Treasury tells everyone that, Russia is not allowed to trade energy or newspapers or perfume, whatever it is, the day after everyone in the West stops trading those items, right? The US doesn't need to get the Germans and the Brits online. The US Treasury just has to, because of the US is the leader in the global economy. It sets the rules, which is one thing that Trump's agenda of autarky and protection. I mean, it will weaken that ability, but the US sets the rules. The US could have done that right at the outset. It decided to try and bring everyone together. And I mentioned we've had sanctions through the highest common denominator. It's meant there's been lots of business interests that have lobbied. I'd say business interests looking after their own interests, but I would also say some of those Western business interests have been infiltrated by Russia. Russia has been able to shape the sanctions narrative, to moderate sanctions on itself, to corrupt the sanctions regime itself from within, right? So we haven't done enough. Russia was given lots of time. It was able to build its defenses. And I think on sanctions, it also, you always want to try and impose a higher cost on the target of sanctions than on yourself, right? It's kind of logical. You want to hurt, the Russian economy than yours. So it's always a difficult, complicated, particularly in a globalized economy with, very complicated supply chains. But I think in the end, you have to be able to take some cost. You have to be willing to bear a burden of sanctions. They can't be cost free. And I think we've not been willing to bear enough of a burden because we haven't really recognized the scale of the threat. If our leaders recognized that Putin was an existential threat to our very system of government, he says he's at war with the West. If we recognize that, the scale of the threat, then we would be willing to commit enough resources to Ukraine to enable it to fund its war and weapons, etc. We'd be willing to impose sufficient of sanctions on Russia that would make Russia change its mind, and we'd be willing to accept a price of those sanctions on ourselves. It's going to hurt some people. Now, I would argue that we've not actually explained all this well enough to our own populations, right? We need to tell them that this Putin is a really bad guy. He's used weapons of mass destruction on the streets of NATO allies twice already. He wants to invade Europe. He wants to change our system of government. He's at war with us. He's a nasty guy. He's not an ally. He's not a future ally against China. We have to defeat him. And it's going to cost us some money, right?
Well, Tim,
it's
that's
going to
just
cost.
the thing. Putin is at war with us. How many times has he said that? His economy is on a wartime footing. My dear God, they're training kindergartners how to assemble and disassemble AK-47s. They're back in Soviet garb and marching, goose stepping in school. They are at war with the West. I don't know of any Western country that said we are at war right now with Russia. I don't mean dropping bombs on Moscow or St. Petersburg, but we are at war with Russia. If they think they're at war with us, well, we're probably at war with them. And that's where, in my opinion, the leadership has fallen the most, not just in not supporting Ukraine, in not telling our own people the truth and garnering their support for putting our economies, I'll say the United States again, putting our economy on a wartime footing. We need factories producing much more ammunition and wartime goods than we are right now. And NATO, that you don't even have to say it, they're way behind as well because they haven't been honest with their people. What can be done, Tim, if we did admit that we're at war, the West, with Russia, and we want Ukraine to win, we want Russia to not have the ability to wage war, what could be done with sanctions to strangle the Russian economy so they cannot wage war within more than maybe one more year? What would you suggest can be done in the best possible world where we said we're at war, we're gonna strangle your economy? What should they do?
Well, we need to adequately fund Ukraine, which is not 100 billion a year. 100 billion a year only holds the line. We need to increase it to 150 billion a year. And we can fund that from frozen Russian assets, the 330 billion that would provide 2.5 years of money. That would match Russian defense spending, which is more or less 140 billion. The Ukrainians have shown an incredible use of innovation and technology in defending themselves against overwhelming odds. Western technology has massively outperformed Russian technology in this war. So if we match Russia in terms of defense spend our defense spend can be much more effective. So I think that would accelerate the end of the war. On sanctions, I think we should tighten secondary sanctions. So we should impose fines and imprisonments on anyone that is helping Russia evade the existing sanctions. It will change behavior. There's a whole industry developed around helping Russia get around the sanctions. That would tighten things. We're already seeing some evidence of that, actually. There has been some tightening, and I think Russia's it's in a more difficult position. The ruble's heading towards 100. There's some evidence that they're struggling a bit on the trade front, and that's because the secondary sanctions have been tightened. There's an interesting idea that a guy called a guy at IIF has put forward, and it's Nigel Gould Davis, an ex-ambassador, British ambassador to Belarus. He argues for a zero sanctions, this idea that essentially you signal to Western business that you shouldn't be doing any business with Russia, right? It should be zero business with Russia without special license. So, you need a very good excuse about why you need to do business with Russia, right? You shouldn't be selling beer or yogurt or, why are you doing that? Why is that a necessity? You shouldn't be. And that would, I think, tighten the net around Russia. It would be a very strong signal to international business. It would be a very strong signal to Russia itself that there's no escape. And obviously, for things that are strategically important to you, key commodities, you can allow them to trade. Now, I'm not saying you do that immediately. I would say, global business needs time to adjust. I'd say, 3-5 year term. But the end date or end plan should be, no business with Russia. Russia is a malign actor. They're an enemy of us. They're doing bad things against our economy. They're doing cyber attacks. They're attacking Ukraine. Again, Novichok, etc., on our streets. They're corrupting us from within. We shouldn't be doing business with Russia. Right?
We should have been there 2.5 years ago. But yes, of course.
Why is it? It should be, the same standard. Should any Western business be doing business with North Korea or Iran? I would say no. There is no real justification for that. It's likewise Russia. We should be avoiding all business at all costs with Russia.
It comes back to leadership or lack thereof. Let me ask you this. We're up against the clock. What is it going to take, Tim, to bring the message home to the Russian people in terms of the economy? What can sanctions do that? I think one of the sayings is in Russia that they have a refrigerator economy, that when they walk to the refrigerator and they see there's no food, then they start to think about politics. Are we going to get there anytime soon, or would the Russian people essentially just let this drag on forever until they're all starving to death or raving alcoholics?
It's interesting. Way at the start of the sanctions regime, if you go back to after the annexation of Crimea, there was a debate that was dominant, was that Western sanctions shouldn't hurt the Russian consumer, right? We shouldn't hurt Russians. We shouldn't sanction Sberbank, the state savings bank, because it handles the accounts of ordinary Russians. And actually, I think as time's gone on, we've realized that actually Russians are supportive of this invasion of Ukraine, right? They've accepted the propaganda from the Kremlin machine. And I think, we have to understand that they are complicit in this invasion and these attacks on the West, and they also have to bear a price. So I would say that we should sufficiently tighten sanctions to have an impact on ordinary Russians, because that will pressurize the leadership in Russia to maybe change what they're doing. I don't buy this line that, Russia can play the long game ultimately. Look, sanctions have not been tight enough, but Russian economy is not doing great. It's not a great place to be. It's in long-term decline. Growth rates are subpar. Inflation is high. There's a lot of capital flight. There's a lot of brain drain. Sanctioned economies do survive, but they're not great places to be. And, Russia is continuing to suffer a huge human cost of this war. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Russians have died through this war. The longer it goes on, the more people will die. Now, I would say we had the Prigozhin, Wagner conspiracy, whatever, last year. No one expected it. Putin is not invulnerable, right? I think the longer it goes on, the more casualties, the more economic cost, the more he has at risk from within of something like that happening, right? And we have to increase the cost to Putin and increase the cost of the Russian population, that they make different decisions.
Can this war be won through economic sanctions and tightening, or does this war have to be won militarily on the battlefield?
Well, I think Timothy Schneider, who's a great historian of Europe, of the Holocaust, of Soviet and Nazi invasions of emerging Europe, he wrote a great book on Bloodlands. He argues that, and I agree with him, that this war shows Russia as a colonizer, an imperialist, right? And I guess the history of decolonialization, if you look at the Brits or the French or you name it, actually they have to suffer a defeat. And I think one of the problems in Russia is Russians themselves still think they are an imperial global power. They haven't accepted their reduced role in the world like us Brits have, or the French or the Turks or whatever. And actually probably military defeat ultimately. If you think of the Brits, it was the Suez Crisis. I guess there's lots of French, probably Indo-Suez, etc. Vietnam, etc. was the game changer. So I think that Schneider is right. I think for the health of Europe and the security of Europe, Russia has to suffer a defeat in Ukraine, so it doesn't do it again. So it doesn't think that might is right, and you can invade countries and steal territory. And actually, there are different ways to conduct relations with your neighbors and partners, right? So I actually think, sanctions are part of the agenda, and I think Western sanctions are important both for helping Ukraine or weaken Russia in its assault on Ukraine, but actually, economic sanctions are important also in weakening Russia in its war with us, right? We have to make sure Russia is not able to regenerate its military technology and capability, and weakening the Russian economy is the best way to do that.
I agree with you 1,000%. I've written and spoken about this. The Russia needs to be defeated militarily, decisively defeated. This is not Putin's war any longer. It may have started that way. This is the Russian people's war. I wrote an article about this 2 or 3 years ago now called "Good Germans," about how the Russian people, and to a lesser extent MAGA, are cult members, and they will not stop until they are decisively defeated or they die, as evidence at the end of World War II with both Germany and Japan. These fanatics were willing to die to the last person, to the last bullet. Now, I'm not saying the Russian people want to do that, but many, and I speak to people in Russia almost every day. I have many contacts there, and they are convinced that Russia's never lost the war. And no, I'm serious. And that Ukraine invaded them, and NATO is encroaching on them, and that this is an existential war for Russia's survival. They believe that down in their mysterious Russian soul, as they say. And nothing short of a total humiliating military defeat is going to change that opinion. And I don't say that lightly, but that's what we're down to. And I think we're going to have to leave it at that note. Tim, I really appreciate it. Let's try to do this again sometime in the future.
Yeah, it's excellent. Thank you very much.
You bet. Take care. Tim Schneider, Tim Ash. See, you got me thinking about Schneider. Timothy Ash.
That's fine. He's a good guy.
No, he is. He is, definitely. Thank you so much. And again, you take care, stay safe, and please stay sane.